When Eleanor Hart unlocked the door of the cottage she had just bought far from the city, the hospital, and everything she used to be, the first thing she saw was not dust. It was lilies, fresh ones, arranged in a jar on the window sill, pale yellow, open wide, like they'd been waiting. She froze. No one had the key. Not her realtor, not the lawyer, not her daughter in Maine, who hadn't called in 3 weeks. And yet, there they were, vivid and soft, filling the small kitchen with a smell that didn't belong in her grief. She shut the door behind her and leaned against it, her cane slipping slightly on the wooden floor. She hadn't walked this far in over a year. The stroke had taken more than her mobility. It had taken her confidence, her nameplate on the office door, the warmth in her friends' voices. No one wanted to drink wine with a woman who forgot where she left her sentence halfway through it. She had come here to this remote village with only one grocer, one post office, and no one who knew her name to disappear, to let herself shrink. But someone had already filled her silence with flowers. Eleanor placed the bouquet on the table and checked the house, step by step, room by room. No one, no sign of entry. Just dust, cracked tiles, and corners that smelled faintly of mildew and old wallpaper glue. And the curtains, she'd brought those herself, yellow, the color of butter and quiet joy. She hadn't meant for them to mean anything. They were cheap and cheerful, like an apology. But the flowers, that was something else. She stood by the window, staring at the road beyond the low fence. No one passed. She was certain she hadn't been followed. She had paid in cash, signed the deed without fanfare. She had made herself small, invisible. So who was seeing her? And why were they remembering something she'd spent 50 years trying to forget? That night, Eleanor sat in the tiny armchair beside the fireplace and watched the lilies fade in the lamplight. Their edges curled slowly inward, like secrets closing. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. Not because of fear, but because something had shifted in the air. Someone knew she was here, and they were not afraid to enter. Eleanor woke with a start at 5:43 a.m., not because of a dream, but because the curtains had moved. She blinked slowly. The light was soft and blue, the kind that stretches across fields before the sun fully rises. Her neck ached from sleeping in the chair. Her cane rested against the fireplace, and the jar of lilies still sat on the table, but now one petal had fallen. She stood carefully, knees stiff, balance cautious, and walked to the window. And there he was. A man. Not on her lawn, not on her porch, but standing at the very edge of the path across the road where the gravel met the field, motionless, like he had been watching for a long time. She squinted. He wore a hat, not a baseball cap, something older, formal, a coat too warm for May, hands behind his back. He didn't move. Eleanor's breath caught. For a wild second, she thought she recognized him, a shape from another life, a shadow from before the hospital bed and the therapists and the friend who couldn't come by any more. But when she blinked again, he was gone. She waited. 10 minutes passed. Nothing. No car, no sound. She opened the front door and stepped outside. Cool air kissed her face. The sky was pale and beginning to bloom. The gravel underfoot shifted as she moved to the edge of the yard and looked down the road. Still nothing. No footprints. No sign. Except a new flower on the porch railing. A single white daisy. No stem, no tag, just resting there like a whisper. At the post office that afternoon, Eleanor spoke to the clerk, a woman with silver hoop earrings and long fingernails painted coral pink. "I'm not expecting mail," Eleanor said carefully, "but is there any chance a delivery came? No address?" The clerk raised an eyebrow. "We don't get mystery packages often, sweetheart." Eleanor hesitated. "Anyone unusual come through town lately?" The clerk chuckled. "This is Claremont. Everyone's unusual. That's how we keep the place running." Then she paused. "Actually, there's a man. Lives 2 plots down from you. Name's Arthur Crane. Doesn't talk much. Lost his wife some years ago. Used to teach shop at the high school." Eleanor's mouth went dry. "Does he wear a hat?" The clerk leaned forward, pleased by the detail. "Always. Felt one. Walks the ridge at sunrise. Bit of a local ghost story. Kids think he lives with 12 cats. I think he just misses someone." Eleanor nodded slowly. She left the post office with no mail in her hands, but a new weight in her chest. That evening, she didn't turn on the lamp. She sat by the window in the dusk, the curtains half closed, watching the edge of the road. And just before the last of the light bled out of the sky, she saw him again, standing in the exact same place. This time, he raised one hand, not a wave, but a small, uncertain greeting, and tipped his hat. Eleanor did not wave back. She didn't close the curtains either. Not yet. Because for the first time in many months, something in her stirred that wasn't fear or sorrow or shame. It was curiosity, and that was a kind of pulse. 2 mornings later, Eleanor found the envelope wedged between the slats of her fence. No stamp, no address. Just her name, written in pencil. Not Mrs. Hart. Just Eleanor. Her first instinct was to leave it there, pretend she hadn't seen it, pretend the breeze had carried it from nowhere, that it didn't belong to her. But her hand moved before her mind decided, and she slipped it from the wood with a gentleness that surprised her. The envelope was thick, but not sealed. Inside, folded twice, was a page torn from a book. Not printed words, but hand-cut paper with faint blue lines. And not a single word was written on it. Not a word. Just the pressed remains of a flower. Lavender. Crushed flat but intact, held in place with a narrow strip of tape, as if someone had sent her silence on purpose. She laid it on the kitchen table and stared at it while the kettle boiled. The lilies were gone now, browning and curled in the compost bin, but the jar remained, rinsed clean, waiting. She didn't know why she felt guilty about it. She hadn't asked for the flowers, or the daisy, or this. And yet it felt like something intimate had been shared, like someone had told her a secret without using their voice. She picked up the lavender page and turned it over. On the back, in the bottom corner, almost invisible, a number. 19. Just that. No explanation. Not a date, not a house number, not an age. Just 19. She placed the note beside her tea and looked out the window. The yellow curtains stirred. Beyond them, the path was empty. No man in a hat. Not this time. That afternoon, Eleanor walked to the edge of her own yard, clutching the envelope in one hand. She stared toward the field, half hoping he would appear, half praying he wouldn't. When nothing moved but the grass, she turned back toward the house and saw another note. This one taped to her door. Not in an envelope. One sentence printed in block letters like a child's writing. You used to read Dickinson in the sun. Eleanor staggered back a step. Not from fear, from memory. Because once, at 19, she had sat on a picnic blanket behind the school library, reading Emily Dickinson aloud while someone watched her from the shadow of a birch tree. She'd pretended not to notice him then, but she had. And suddenly, she remembered his name. Arthur. Inside, she placed both the flower page and the note beside her tea. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her old journal, the one she hadn't touched since the stroke. She opened to a blank page, picked up a pen, and for the first time in over a year, began to write. Arthur Crane, shop class, Birches, spring of '68. The words were uneven, the letters clumsy, but they came. And when she stopped, she wasn't crying. She was smiling. Because someone hadn't forgotten her. And for the first time in months, she didn't want to forget herself either. It happened on a Thursday, just after lunch. A sharp snap somewhere distant but definite, and then the refrigerator sighed, the lights dimmed, and silence fell too completely. Eleanor stood in the middle of the kitchen, her hands still damp from rinsing a single teacup. The stillness was so total it made her heart knock hard in her chest. No hum, no buzz, just the creak of the old clock on the mantel and the whisper of wind against glass. She waited. 10 seconds. 20. Then she stepped to the window. And there he was. Arthur. Closer this time. Not at the end of the path, but just beyond the fence, one hand resting lightly on the wooden post as if testing how close he was allowed to be. Eleanor's breath caught. She could feel the foolishness in her chest, the way it rose, fragile and fluttering, like the heat from a half-lit flame. She opened the door. Didn't call out. Just stood on the porch. Arthur nodded once, tipping his hat in greeting. Then, with quiet finality, he stepped inside the gate and walked up the path. She didn't move. When he reached the steps, he stopped. I have candles, he said, voice soft as corduroy. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Do you always arrive during blackouts? He smiled gently. Only when it's fate. She almost laughed. Almost. Instead, she stepped aside and opened the door wider. He placed the candles on the table without asking permission. He lit one, then another. The kitchen filled with honey-colored light, and the faint scent of old wax and warmth. He turned to her. "I hope the flowers weren't too much." Eleanor folded her hands together to keep them from trembling. "You broke into my house." He shook his head. "The key was under the stone frog by the porch. I remembered you used to hide everything under frogs." She blinked, stunned. "That was 60 years ago. I remember things worth remembering." Silence. Then, "Why?" Arthur looked at her with eyes softened by years of quiet. "Because you were kind, even when you were popular, even when I was the boy with crooked teeth and oil under his nails. And when I heard you'd moved back here alone, I thought, maybe you shouldn't feel forgotten." Eleanor lowered her gaze. The silence swelled again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full with all the things they hadn't said, the years they hadn't lived together, the time they'd missed, and the odd, impossible comfort of this moment. Arthur added, "I never married after Clara, but you were always the one I remembered in yellow." Eleanor looked up slowly. "What yellow?" He gestured at the window. "The curtains. You wore a dress like that once in spring, with a blue book in your lap and dandelion seeds in your hair." She felt it then, that absurd, tender pull in her chest, the one she thought had been buried with the woman she used to be. "You remembered all that?" He nodded. "Some things don't fade." She stepped forward, and for the first time in a very long time, she reached out her hand. He took it, warm, solid, real. Not a ghost, not a memory. A man, alive, and seeing her not as she had been, but as she was now, and still worth remembering. The next morning, Eleanor opened the hallway drawer she had ignored since moving in. It held exactly what she expected, a mess. Twine, screws, batteries that had long since died, and at the very back, a faded velvet pouch, the kind that once held something of value. Inside it, 3 silver thimbles and a folded square of linen embroidered with a half-finished pattern of violets. She sat down slowly at the kitchen table, the linen trembling slightly in her hands. It was her mother's work, or hers. She couldn't remember now, but her fingers did. As if stirred by the memory, they moved instinctively, touching the threads, tracing the loops. Her joints ached, but it was a good ache, the kind that comes with familiarity, not pain. The cane leaned against the wall beside her, unused. For a moment, she forgot it was there. Later that afternoon, Arthur returned. He brought a basket of fresh eggs, a loaf of bread, and a notebook. "Don't get too excited," he said. "It's not poetry." Eleanor smiled, her cheeks still pink from the short walk she'd taken around the yard. Inside the notebook were clippings, announcements from the town bulletin, notices from the library, local newsletters. She flipped through absently. Then she stopped. One page had been circled in red ink. Community Center, seeking volunteers for weekly skills hour, open to all ages, especially teens with learning needs, craft, build, cook, men share what you know. She looked up at Arthur. His eyes didn't waver. "I know you're trying to stay invisible, But maybe someone needs to see you, and maybe you need to see them too." Eleanor's throat tightened. "I haven't sewn in years. Not properly." Arthur smiled softly. "That linen on your table says otherwise." She didn't answer right away. But that evening she brought down her old box of thread and began sorting the tangled mess, color by color, into little dishes. By the end of the week, the community center had a new listing on the schedule: Quiet Stitching Fridays at 4 p.m. for teens who think they can't. Eleanor wasn't sure what to expect. She was sure no one would come. But on that first Friday, 3 teenagers arrived. One was a tall boy who barely spoke and kept his hoodie pulled tight over his head. Another was a girl with anxious fingers who confessed she had never sewn a thing. The third was a boy with braces and too much energy, who knocked over the box of embroidery hoops in the first 2 minutes and called her ma'am so often she almost sent him home just to avoid hearing it again. They stayed. They stitched. They asked questions, laughed awkwardly, and left with uneven flowers blooming across scraps of cloth. And Eleanor? She stood at the window afterward, watching the sun slip behind the hill, and whispered to the empty room, "I mattered today." She hadn't said those words in a very long time, and even though no one answered, the yellow curtains shifted gently in the breeze, as if the house agreed. One Friday afternoon, 3 weeks into her embroidery sessions, the girl with anxious fingers stayed behind. Her name was Lila. She hovered near the table long after the others had left, winding a piece of blue thread around her pinky finger until Eleanor gently touched her wrist and said, "You're going to cut off your circulation, sweetheart." Lila looked up. "Can I show you something?" Eleanor nodded, expecting a photo or a drawing. But Lila reached into her backpack and pulled out a garment bag, wrinkled and stained, the zipper broken halfway. She laid it on the table with trembling hands. Inside was a dress. Not new, not old, just unfinished. The hem was raw. One sleeve was attached with safety pins. The fabric was soft cotton, printed with pale roses, and the bodice was too small for anyone but a girl who had learned to hide inside herself. "My mom started it," Lila said, eyes fixed on her own shoes, "but she left before she finished." Eleanor didn't speak. She simply reached out and ran her hand gently over the fabric. Yeah, the stitches were uneven, rushed, but there was care in them, a tenderness under the panic. "I want to finish it," Lila said, voice cracking. "I just don't know how." Eleanor looked at her, really looked, and saw more than thread. She saw abandonment, hope, hunger, and a question stitched deep between every fold. "Will someone help me hold this together?" They began that evening. Side by side, the two of them worked, one experienced, one determined. The dress changed slowly. The raw edges were hemmed, the sleeve replaced. Tiny embroidered violets bloomed near the collar. Lila's idea. They worked in silence mostly, but the silence was not empty. It was calm, safe, like the hush inside a cocoon. When the dress was finished, Lila insisted on trying it on in the little bathroom off the hallway. Eleanor waited by the window, heart beating for reasons she didn't fully understand. When the door creaked open, Lila stepped out. And she was radiant. Not because the dress was perfect, it wasn't, but because she stood straight. Her arms were uncovered, her hair was brushed back. She looked at Eleanor and smiled, really smiled for the first time since they'd met. "I feel like I made something real," she said. Eleanor walked over, placed both hands gently on the girl's shoulders and said, "You didn't just finish a dress, Lila. You finished a memory." Lila blinked fast. I think my mom would have liked it. I know she would." And in that moment, the age between them melted. They were just two women, stitched together by thread, grief, and the quiet belief that things broken could still be made beautiful. Later that night, Eleanor sat by the fire, the dress carefully folded in her lap. She watched the flames flicker, the yellow curtains glowing gold behind her. Arthur arrived as the clock struck 8, carrying a small plate of lemon shortbread and a photograph. He handed it to her without a word. It was a photo from 1971, faded, blurry. A young woman in a yellow dress sitting under a birch tree, laughing with a book in her lap. Eleanor stared at it. She didn't remember the picture being taken, but she remembered the feeling. "I kept it all this time," Arthur said. She looked at him. "I'm still that girl," she whispered. He smiled softly. "I know. That's why I came back." The community center asked if Eleanor would be willing to display some of the work her group had done, just a few pieces, they said, for the summer fair. Nothing formal, nothing big. She said no, at first. She said no because her knees still ached on rainy days, because her left hand sometimes tingled with the memory of what the stroke had taken, because she didn't want to be seen trying and failing. But Lila said, "They asked because they think what we made matters." And Arthur, who had taken to visiting every evening, added gently, "You used to teach rooms full of people. Why are you so afraid to let a few walk by your window now?" So she said yes. Not loudly, not quickly, but with enough certainty to begin again. On the morning of the fair, Eleanor woke earlier than usual. The yellow curtain fluttered in a breeze already thick with the scent of sugar and distant barbecue. From her window, she could see tents rising in the field behind the post office, stripes of red and white, children with balloons, tables covered in quilts, and jars of jam. Her table was set up under a cherry tree, a small one, shy with blossoms, and covered in a cloth she had embroidered just last week with Lila's help. There were hoops displaying flowers, stitched animals, a tiny forest on navy linen, but in the center of the table sat Lila's dress, ironed, gently draped, and pinned to a handmade mannequin that Arthur had built from an old coat rack and twine. Eleanor stood behind it all, wearing her best gray cardigan and a necklace she hadn't touched in years. The teens from her group came, some nervously, some with too much energy, and lingered close like small birds and uncertain weather. Then people came, not just friends, strangers, and they stopped. They admired. Hey, some asked questions. Others didn't say a word, but looked, really looked. And Eleanor didn't shrink from it. She stood straighter than she had in a decade, her cane resting at her side, forgotten. Later, as the sun began to set, Lila came to her, cheeks flushed from running between booths. They asked if you'd do it again. She said breathlessly, Do what again? This, the club, the table, all of it. Eleanor smiled. I haven't decided yet. You will. Lila's voice was light, but her eyes were full of something deeper trust. And that, more than the compliments or the ribbons or even the applause that came when the dress was announced as most meaningful entry, filled Eleanor with something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Pride. Not in what she had done, but in what she still could do. That evening, Arthur walked her home. He didn't speak much, neither did she. But as they reached the yellow-curtained house, she paused at the gate. It was open. She hadn't left it that way. Inside on the porch rail, a flower waited. Not a lily this time, not a daisy, but a violet carefully pressed between two stones. She looked at Arthur, and he didn't pretend it wasn't him. He simply said, I thought you might need one more. Eleanor didn't answer. She stepped inside, placed the flower on the table beside the old velvet pouch, and looked around her house. The walls were the same. The floor still creaked. The tea kettle still whistled if you let it sit too long. But something had changed. She had filled it with work, with warmth, with people who stitched themselves into her life without demanding to be sown. And for the first time since the stroke, for the first time in years, she no longer felt like she was waiting to vanish. She had returned, not to who she was, but to someone even better. Years passed gently in Claremont. Seasons folded softly into one another like the petals Eleanor had once pressed between pages. The apricot tree she planted with Lila bloomed too early one year, and she said it was the best mistake she ever made. The window with the yellow curtains remained untouched, washed only by spring winds and the sunlight of quiet mornings. Eleanor's club outgrew the community center by the second year. Teens came from 3 villages over. Some stayed, some left. But each one took a needle, a thread, and a part of her with them. They stitched animals, poems, names of those they missed. One boy stitched only abstract swirls, explaining that he had too many feelings to organize them. She told him, That's embroidery, too. Arthur built shelves in her back room where she kept the fabric now. He never moved in. Officially, they were too old for that, she said, but his coat always hung on the third hook, and his books found a home under her window bench. Sometimes he brought her flowers. Sometimes she left him notes in his mailbox, signed with a small violet. When her knees gave out again, it was Arthur who taught her to work, sitting down. When his eyes started to blur, it was she who read to him, Dickinson mostly. And every Friday at 4, a bell above the yellow curtained door chimed gently, and laughter filled the house again. On her 83rd birthday, Eleanor woke early. She walked the perimeter of the garden slower now, a cane in hand, and greeted each flower aloud by name. She brewed tea, buttered toast, and sat in her favorite chair. The mail arrived in a plain white envelope. No stamp. Inside, a card stitched with thread. The words read, "You never disappeared. You just paused. And then you bloomed." No signature. But she knew the handwriting. And when she looked up from the card, the sun hit the curtains just right, turning them into soft gold like the light inside an old memory. She closed her eyes and smiled. She didn't feel young. She didn't need to. She felt real, held, present. In the house, she had come to escape the world. She had become part of it again. And the house that once echoed with silence, now remembered her with every stitch, every flower, every open door. Have you ever thought your story was over, only to find a new beginning waiting in silence? What second chances bloomed in your life, even when you thought it was too late? Share your thoughts below. Someone may need your story more than you know.